You ever wanted to create a deep, expansive Miliastra game with several features and abilities that your players could combine together using Genshin's combat system for a truly unique gameplay experience? But our Lord Dalway said, in this video, we will discuss matters about how certain key Miliastra features work, what are good game design practices to follow, as well as how these change and apply in the context of designing your very own Wonderland. In developing my first Miliastra game, I learned a lot about how the editor functions, how to approach several do's and don'ts, and things that you should just keep in mind while designing and developing for your very own Miliastra game. Let's start off with defining the scope and boundaries of your Wonderland. In the context of game design, this means not only defining the core features of your game, but also how will they be structured and implemented in the programming software that you chose for it. And in order to do that, you must also know the capabilities and limitations of said software and how to work with them whenever possible and around them when not possible. Imagine you were tasked to cut down a tree. An axe can cut down a tree just fine, right? So you pick up the axe and cut down the tree. But later you find out that you're actually supposed to cut down a whole clearing's worth of trees. Suddenly you're gonna find yourself wishing that you picked up the fancy chainsaw for the job instead. What does this mean for Miliastra? This is where I made some of my first mistakes when developing my own game. I assumed that, because the sandbox uses Genshin Impact as a base, that it would be able to support all of Genshin Impact's pre-existing features right out of the box. But that's not exactly the case here. Instead, Miliastra Sandbox is a much more open-ended and free-form game engine than I had originally anticipated. If I had researched the possibilities and inner workings beforehand, I would have definitely planned and developed things differently from the get-go, instead of having to re-evaluate my features after I was already halfway through implementing them. You must know your tool before you start working on your task. Here are some of the known current limits about the Miliastra Sandbox. This list was compiled by several dedicated Miliastra developers over at the official Creator Found Discord server, which you should absolutely join if you plan on creating your own Wonderland. There's always a skilled creator waiting to help you with any questions you may have about the editor at any time of the day, as well as useful resources like this list that I just showed you, FAQs, and many others. Here, in Miliastra Sandbox, is where your organization skills as a developer will be tested. If your game idea is very ambitious and could end up running into one of those limits, you will need to implement logic and countermeasures to avoid reaching that outcome. Say you want to add a bow skill to your Wonderland. This bow skill has several different elements that it could be based on the weapon, based on your character class, and etc. Instead of creating several arrow local projectiles, you could create one server prefab with the intended bullet behavior. Local projectiles and server prefabs both occupy one prefab ID slot either way, so having these projectiles be created via local to server signals and having them mount VFX on themselves as well as activate different ability units based on the element that they should be when used by that character or weapon can end up being less costly on your prefab slots. Similar logic can be applied to skills with similar behavior between each other for the same purpose. You also gain an advantage for creating your projectiles as server prefabs and not local projectiles. They become reusable. If you wanted enemies to be able to spawn these projectiles as well, you could do so easily if they're server prefabs, but you cannot do the same if they're local projectiles. Another example would be when configuring items and loot. Items occupy configuration ID slots, meaning one could create many items before running into any Miliastra limitations. However, a loot configuration does use a prefab ID, meaning it occupies a precious prefab slot in your game. Now, obviously, if your intended gameplay actually requires loot components to deliver certain resources or items to your players, then you will have to sacrifice some of your slots to those loot configurations. But you could also create more generalized loot appearances for each category of loot instead of creating a unique appearance for every item that will be acquired via loot, and save up on prefab slots that way too. And, of course, it goes without saying that if your Wonderland has prefabs that do not actually need to be prefabs, as in they don't need to be created mid-execution repeatedly, then unlike other game engines, where you could still have it as a prefab anyway, in the off chance that you might need to create it mid-execution in the future, here in Miliastra, you will want to have it as a regular entity instead. as you want to have access to every single one of your slots that you do have for these features, in case your Wonderland expands past the initial scope. Another limitation that certain Wonderlands may face is the amount of load each node execution cycle takes. If your game, for example, has a map creation feature where it generates a lot of prefabs or prefab groups at once, following a set logic pattern to initiate the game, if all that logic simply runs raw, it will very likely run into the excessive asset usage is causing high server load prompt that causes you to be returned to the editor if you're in test mode, or outright sends players back to the lobby if it happens in a game that is being played on the live server. This is because the amount of load required to run all of those functions at once was too high, and the execution of the logic cycle took longer to be processed by the server than what Miliastra has set as acceptable, therefore terminating the game entirely to avoid server sting or possible infinite loading cycles that bypassed their internal logic for identifying those. The features that experienced creators use to avoid running into this problem are the usage of structs, signal chains, and recursive signals to separate the execution logic across several cycles and avoid overloading any one cycle in particular. Using different entities to handle each part of the execution logic may also be needed in some extreme scenarios as well. It is already good programming practice to divide the execution of features and delegate them to each specific entity, or in the case of other game engines, different classes, scripts, and game objects. And when developing in Miliastra, having this in mind at all times becomes essential to not run into these game-ending prompts. However, logic partition and separation may not always be so obvious or immediate. Certain nodes can only run on certain entities. There are nodes that are exclusive to the stage entity, and some that must run on characters or players specifically in order to function. And while we could simply have them where they need to be, because of the limitation of 10 node graphs per entity, you end up in a sticky situation once again. Do you go with the usual practice of separating all of your node logic chains into individual node graphs for easier readability, but risk actually running into the limit if your game expands past the initial scope? Or do you turn all of your node graphs into spaghetti webs, crossing and turning, piling nodes on top of each other, all so that they can be in the same gigantic node graph to save up on your graph slots? This is where the secret third option reveals itself: forwarding event. This singular powerful node can solve both issues at once. By using forwarding event, you can essentially give any entity of your choosing the ability to listen for a specific event node, even if they wouldn't be able to normally. This allows you to unmarry certain functionality from the intended set target, like creating an entirely separate entity for handling the logic that runs upon removal of entities in your Wonderland, allowing your stage entity more room to breathe when it comes to node graph slots in the process. We could talk about the specificity of certain Miliastra features for hours. These are the ones that I happened to run head first into when creating my first Wonderland and affected my development the most. And so, I relay them to you, so you may already know and develop accordingly to get a better outcome than I did. Spend your time making new mistakes, so that we can all grow and improve as a creation community together. Now for some more crucial game design lessons. We've talked about features, development, and planning, but arguably just as important as creating is caring for how your player interacts with your creation. And here, of course, I am talking about UI and UX. These are some of the trickiest aspects to tackle in any game, and even AAA games fumble them sometimes. A game's UI and UX, when done perfectly, is the lifeblood that will make players flow through your game like a river and not like sludge. These go hand in hand with your game's first impression as well. Spawn your player into several walls of rule stacks from frame 1, and it might close every single one of them without reading a single word, fail your game from the onset, leave, and never come back. Tutorialize them with minimal UI elements, naturally emerging gameplay, tooltips, and navigational icons instead, and they might complete the whole game before they even notice that they did it, because they were so immersed in it to be able to do so. Here's where creators in Miliastra have to be extra cautious. Some of the UI is currently set and cannot be changed. You must design around the limitations once more if your game has to use these UI elements, doubly so for inventory and equipment features. Let me give you an example for why good UI and UX are so important. My game is heavily centered around the inventory and equipment features in Miliastra. Predicting this, I added that information to my game description, something that players can read before the game starts. Later, after receiving some initial complaints of players not knowing there was an equipment system in my game, I also added that information to the table at the start as a tab that triggers a pop-up, said table being accessible before players can begin playing the game, and as a little nameplate above the first enemy camp that players were most likely to tackle. It was not enough. Not even close, in fact. For several weeks after launch, I was still getting negative player feedback about players not being aware that there was an equipment feature to my game, even after I added all those instances of me trying to inform the players of such. It was only after I added a reminder tooltip that would sit to the side of the player's UI for a whole minute whenever a player picked up a new category of equipment that they haven't equipped yet, that I was finally able to extinguish the possibility of players not knowing about the equipment system in my game. The key difference here, in case you would be inclined to think that it was the player's fault for not reading, is that good UX accounts for how different kinds of gameplay sessions will go and when the information will be presented to the player. You need to account for the kind of player that will read every word that you put in your game diligently, and the player who will just rush ahead and get a feel for things via experiencing them themselves. Neither style of player is less valid than the other, and you as a developer must account for both if you want your game's UX to be as good as possible. And just as importantly as that, relevant information must be displayed when it is relevant. If I tell you about an equipment system before you even know how my game plays, how you obtain the equipment, how would that help you? And if you can even equip something right now or not, it's almost the same as me not telling you about it. Another aggravating feature in this instance was the fact that I was using equipable equipment specifically. You may not need to go to extreme lengths to have players be aware of a feature if they can simply access it by playing your game normally. If you set up your equipment affixes to be in effect upon being obtained and not upon being equipped, then the fact that a player simply didn't bother to open their inventory window won't impact their core gameplay experience as much as it would if your equipment effects is set to only take effect when actually equipped to an equipment slot. And at the time that my game was launched, there were no auto-equip nodes in Miliastra Sandbox, so that really was a big structural deficiency of my game that I did not account for in my UX structure. If that happens to your game too, don't be discouraged. It's extremely easy for us as developers to become too familiar with our own games, to the point that we do not see these small cracks in our own game structure. This is also why having new people constantly helping you test and give you feedback is of extreme importance for any game that is interested in being the best version of itself that it could possibly be. This is how you will know if your UI and UX implementations are good or if they still need more polish. And this is where I would like to remind you about the official Miliastra Creator Front server, as it has several different players that are willing to help you playtest your game in order to help you identify these structural issues that your game might have, and that you should absolutely join in order to gain access to these people as well as other benefits. Now, let's talk about guidance. Guidance throughout a gameplay session is also extremely important. If players are simply idling in your game, not quite sure of what to do next, and that information isn't readily available for them, then your UX has failed them. And this is not about being hand-holdy. Your game can rely on naturally occurring cues for player guidance, yes, but it is still your job to make sure that players will understand that they're being guided by said invisible hand. And if your game is not built around that, then you need to give extra attention to the concept of guidance, while still following the rules of how and when to guide them. You, as a developer of the game, may know how to proceed at any given moment, but if your players aren't being properly informed, then they simply won't be able to complete your game. Always make sure that you're on top of a player's gameplay flow through your game, and that they never get stuck anywhere in that flow. unless you very specifically want them to feel stuck for whatever particular reason, say like in a scary or atmospheric type of game. In the context of Miliastra, empty nameplates with navigational icons are perfect for more direct player guidance. You can create two nameplates, one with a navigational icon and a second one that is truly empty, and alternate between the two via node graphs, or when you want to show your players something and when it is no longer relevant. When in multiplayer, combining this feature with Boolean filters means that you can show each individual player exactly what they need to see at every moment throughout your entire gameplay session with no problems. There's tons more that we could talk about, as game design is simply that deep, and it is no different for Miliastra. Things such as the importance of a great game cover or thumbnail, a good stage description, even though you still have to account for the players that will skip reading them, how having translations for your game can be a massive game changer depending on the region, and so much more. But as is, this script is getting quite long. These were the major topics that I ran into when designing my first Miliastra game, and what I learned from them. I hope you enjoyed this video, and learned something from it too. Make sure to join the official Creator Front server if you plan on becoming a Miliastra craftsperson, and I hope to see how your first Wonderland turned out soon too. This is Dark Stargazer, signing out. Take care!